Welcome. This Zoom webinar is presented by Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at UCSC. I'm Dean Goddard, the moderator. In her commentaries on international affairs, Professor Emerita Ronnie Gruhn will talk for half an hour and answer questions for half an hour. Please submit your questions for Ronnie through the Zoom Q&A feature, and you may start to do that right now. We will not use your names. We're recording this webinar Monday, March 8, and we'll put it on YouTube later. Ronnie's talk today is the Middle East, taking stock. We've put a link to a map of the Middle East and Africa in the chat. If you look at your meeting controls, one is called chat. And if you click on that, you will see the link, and then click on the link and it will open in your browser, and you can switch back and forth between your browser and Zoom. We'll also put that link in the description in YouTube for this video. Remember that you can send your questions now through the Q&A feature, and at any time during Ronnie's talk. I'll be back later to ask those questions. Ronnie?
Greetings, folks. Yes, the Middle East, big subject. A person has to be crazy to talk for half an hour about this complicated subject. But quite a lot of things have shifted in the Middle East in recent weeks and months. And it's important for international affairs in general and US foreign policy in specific. So I'd like to talk a little about this and the changes that have taken place. So we've all gotten adjusted for years now that there was the Arab-Israeli conflict. With the exception of Egypt and Jordan, which recognized Israel some years ago through negotiations, none of the countries in the Middle East essentially recognized Israel. And Israel was, at least in theoretical conflict with them all. Now, here I want to remind everybody that the so-called Arab-Israeli conflict was between Israel and the Arab-speaking countries. The description of Arab is people who speak Arabic. It is not necessarily people who are Muslims only. I have mentioned in the past that, for example, the largest Muslim country in the world isn't in the Middle East at all, it's Indonesia. So we need to keep apart the Arab and the Muslim issue. And of course, Israel has been the sore spot in that part of the world because of the Palestinian issue. But many of the Arab countries have, for one reason or another, either fared very poorly. For example, some of the North African countries, I'll refer to those again in a minute, and or fared reasonably well because of the oil resources, which made them affluent. For example, the United Arab Emirates, places like Iraq, certainly Saudi Arabia, were important for the rest of the world because of oil and the dependency on the oil from there. So they've had a fair amount of leverage to continue the sort of Arab-Israeli conflict. On the other hand, Israel, as we know, is a very modern and industrial country, and it has had a right-wing government for some time, Netanyahu, right, and various coalition right-wing parties. And he had, over the years, done something reasonably useful from the perspective of the state of Israel, namely to say to the countries, okay, so we're in conflict and you don't recognize us, but we really have useful technology, arms, and technical know-how to help you guys develop. And quite a few of these countries sort of on the margin sold out in the sense that they would harangue Israel in public, but in point of fact began to have some liaisons and some informal links with Israel. Then the next thing that happened was the Trump administration, which encouraged the Israelis to foster relationships with the Arab countries that didn't recognize them and continue any kind of links that they had established. But on top of that, the Trump administration bribed many of the Arab countries, some of the small Arab countries, and said, if you recognize Israel, we will sell you arms and technology. A good example of this is if you look on your map, you can see there is Morocco on the northwest side on top of the African continent. And Morocco has been in conflict over something called the Western Sahara, which is a territory sort of below it, which goes down a little bit on the West African side. It's mainly desert, but sort of 1 million people roam around in the desert there. And years ago, this territory was divided between Mauritania, which is a northwest African country, and Morocco. This may seem very arcane, but for years now, there has been both conflict and terrorism between Morocco and Western Sahara. Morocco wants to annex with the Western Sahara. The people who live there don't want to be annexed with Morocco. The UN has been dealing with this for years now in very complicated ways. So the Trump administration comes along and says, look, Morocco, we will recognize that the Western Sahara is part of Morocco if you recognize Israel. So you can see on this particular case, but there are other cases where a certain amount of bribery will give you something, namely American recognition that the Western Sahara is part of Morocco, which, by the way, is against all United Nations actions and promises to the people who live in the Western Sahara, as long as you recognize Israel. So during the Trump administration, I would say more or less most of the Arab countries were in general bribed in one fashion or another to recognize the state of Israel by a combination of Israeli policy itself and some thrust from the United States, some promise for military hardware, technology, and all the rest. It's also the case that all the countries, including Saudi Arabia and others, recognize that oil is of diminishing value in this century and that they need to diversify the economy. I mean, one of the virtues, supposedly, of the current ruler or king-to-be, MBS as he's called, was that he recognized he has to modernize Saudi Arabia. And in order to do that, he needs input from the rest of the world, technological know-how of one kind or another, investments and all the rest. And a combination of the United States and Israel pushing that is to say, we will help you if you recognize us, has spurred on the overall recognition of the end, so to speak, of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the recognition of Israel. Now, it gets even more complicated in the sense that while we've been used to for decades for the Arab-Israeli conflict, as the Arab-Israeli conflict has been put to bed, so to speak, in terms of all the countries now more or less recognizing each other and recognizing Israel, simultaneously, there has been the development and the growth of the Shiite-Sunni conflict, which of course is a religious conflict in which Iran is the dominant mover and shaker for the Shiite part of the religion, while many of the Arab countries are in fact mostly Sunni countries. So in a funny sort of way, in the last few months, the Arab-Israeli conflict has been substituted by giving full voice and full focus to the Shiite Sunni conflict. So in a sense, that part of the world is still in serious conflict, only the nature of the conflict has swapped. Now, one of the things, of course, is that in all of this, who has lost or who has won? Well, Israel has won. In a sense, it's now recognized by almost everybody in the region. The North African and most of the Middle East countries put Iran aside, have won in the sense that the recognition bought them something of value that they need for their future as they see it. And by having, gotten, everybody has sort of come out ahead, or so it looks. Well, I haven't mentioned the Palestinians. They have been lost in the cause, right? Because the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians and what to do about the Palestinian issue has not been addressed throughout any of this. And in some ways, if you're a Palestinian, you will say, well, your fellow Arab countries have sold you out, have essentially looked out for their own national interests, and you have to now fend for yourself. I mean, they might support you rhetorically, but essentially the leverage that the whole region had on Israel over the conflict has been given away for national benefits of all these countries. So now you have, the Palestinians out there. And it's useful to remember that there are Palestinians, most of them are Palestinians and some other Arabs in Israel, right, itself. And it's interesting that Israel itself refers to those as Arab Israelis. They don't refer to them as Palestinian Israelis, they refer to them as Arab Israelis. The two-state solution seems to be dead. What has been offered by the Israelis for a two-state solution is bits and pieces that don't coagulate as a country, right? A piece of desert here and a piece there, and meantime settlements everywhere. So it's a cheese board that the Palestinians would inherit, even if there was a two-state solution, and that's not acceptable. On the Palestinian side, of course, they've had very bad leadership. It's a very bad situation. And so while everything sort of looks like it's better now in terms of Arab-Israeli stuff, the area of actual and potential conflict and the people that are really suffering are, of course, the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. And this is not just sort of existential. I mean, this is real for anybody who's visited that part of the world. It is very difficult to be a Palestinian. It's very difficult to be a Gazan. It is true that Palestinians now and then go over the border and terrorists kill some Israelis, but it's also the case that when one or two Israelis get killed, the hell is bombed out of, let's say, Gaza, apartment buildings, hospitals, and so forth. And in the United Nations and elsewhere, there's then discussion, are these crimes against humanity? Because you're not supposed to take revenge on civilian population or target civilian population. The Israeli government, of course, says, well, we expected there were terrorists in the hospital or living in the apartment buildings and so forth. That's a very kind of complicated issue. So the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians has not gone away and theoretically could blow up. The lack of participation on the part of other Middle Eastern Arab countries is fairly clear. Now, setting this aside for a minute, you then get to Iran. And of course, Iran is the dominant Shiite country in the region. It supports Hezbollah in Lebanon. Lebanon is a total mess, as we all know. And so the Shiites in Lebanon make it very difficult to sort out Lebanese politics. There are Shiites, bits and pieces of Shiites living elsewhere. You will have noticed that the Pope visited Iraq, which is an utter mess, thanks in part to the United States, and met with the Ayatollah Sistani, who is the sort of clerical guru of the Shiites in Iraq. The Pope is trying to have say peaceful things, that how people in other religions, in his case Christians, of which there are very few left in Iraq, are treated and discriminated against, but also presumably the Sunnis versus the Shiites in Iraq. And of course, the Iranians are armed to the hilt, and there's the whole nuclear question and whether or not the Biden administration can get a new nuclear agreement and an agreement of some kind. Let me quickly switch to that and say that the Shiite-Sunni mess is, of course, played out in Yemen. And the Iranians support the Shiites in Yemen against the government, while Saudi Arabia has been supporting the rest of the government, the non-Shiites, the non-Houthis. The consequence of that is that much of the arms that the US and others have sold to the Sunnis are now visited upon the heads of the Yemenis. And Yemen is considered the biggest humanitarian disaster in the world right now. So that's of some interest because it's linked to Iran and Iran's policies, and to what extent the Biden administration and the other signatories to the original nuclear deal with Iran can impact that situation at all. Well, the first thing that the Biden administration did was to curtail the arms sales that are used against the Yemenis on the part of Saudi Arabia. And that's actually was a very good, quick first step. Then the question is, in negotiations with the Iranians over nuclear issues, can deals be made for the sorting out of the Yemeni war? That is to say that the Iranians will trade recognition and treaties and forgiveness of loans, and the Iranians are in huge difficulty right now with not having enough money to buy vaccines, etc. Will the Iranians be willing to bargain through a list of things that can be offered to the Iranians to come back under the nuclear umbrella? And that's all very complicated, and some of you may want to raise questions about that. So one of the things one can say is that the Biden administration took very quick steps to try to influence Saudi Arabia on the Yemen issue. It hasn't brought any benefit as yet. And at the same time, we'll try to use some leverage against the Iranians when renegotiations with the Iranians start at some point, to also argue for the lack of support that should be given to the conflict in Yemen. So the Yemen issue is a big area of conflict. So the Arab-Israeli conflict has gone away. The Yemen civil war is a huge problem. The Iranian versus Shiite versus Sunni issue plays itself out in a place like Yemen, and is whether that can be contained is an entire open question. The funny sort of bottom line to all this confusion and all this mess is, of course, that the US has been a major actor in the Middle East. And it's done in part because if you look at the map, you can see how important the Middle East is between, movement between Europe and the Middle East and Africa, both historically and even contemporarily. So the Middle East has always played an important part in Europe, in Eastern Asia, in Western Asia, actually, sorry about that. But also in terms of the US role in the world, and the US is trying to, renegotiate some of this. It's taken, as I said, steps with Yemen, it's taken steps in Saudi Arabia. And that whole issue with Saudi Arabia, of course, was raised again in the report that MBS is, in fact, had ordered the killing of Khashoggi. And then why did the Biden administration not take a stronger stand and sanction him directly? And there, reasonable people can differ. What the Biden administration is trying to do is to say he's the head of state and for a long time will probably continue to be the head of state and become the king. And sanctioning him is not particularly useful because we need to have relations with Saudi Arabia. It's still important for a variety of reasons. Sanctioning the people around him and making Saudi Arabia a little bit into a pariah state, which is not in the interest of Saudi Arabia as it's trying to diversify its economy and get external investments, might be enough leverage to bring them to heel. Now, the murder of that journalist was, of course, horrendous, right? And they chopped him up in little pieces and everything. On the other hand, of course, there are other dictators in the world that have done similar things or have killed journalists and other people. And every time that happens, we condemn it and we sanction and we do all kinds of things, but we normally don't do anything about the head of state, except sometimes in African countries when the heads of state step down, then they're hauled in front of the International Criminal Court. So that has happened. So, as I said, reasonable people can argue whether the Biden administration should have taken a stronger stand against MBS or not. But in any event, it's not like we didn't take a stand and we haven't tried to leverage against Saudi's worst behavior. So on the one hand, MBS has been modernizing the Sudan, women can drive, this, that, and the other thing. On the other hand, it has done, horrendous things in terms of human rights, imprisoning people and all the rest, which of course is against violations of human rights. So Saudi Arabia is on the one hand, on the other, and we can discuss it. So where are we in terms of the Middle East? We are in the situation of a changed Middle East that we have to adjust to. We are in a position to repopulate the State Department with some expertise. The person that has been appointed to try to restart the negotiations of the group with Iran is a man named Rob Malley, who is a very experienced negotiator in the Middle East and with Iran. And he has generated a fairly long list of carrots and sticks to get Iran eventually to the table. In the meantime, the Biden administration is trying to look tough. That is to say, it responded in its attack on Syria, which is also very controversial. Was that a smart thing to do or not? And it has targeted Iranian, when Iran has targeted the base in Iraq, where not a military, but a consultant was killed. And again, in Syria, the US has quickly responded, but responded in a very narrow fashion to give signals to the Iranians, hey, if you do that sort of thing, we can't be of any help and negotiations won't go forward. The Iranians, of course, know that the US is caught between a rock and a hard place. It badly wants to put, the treaty and some version of it back on track. At the same time, the Iranians can make some kind of mischief. And if the US overreacts, the Iranians are in a good position to say, hey, you. So it's an incredibly messy situation. The Middle East has always been messy and will continue to be messy. And now you have, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the mess in Yemen. On the other hand, the recognition of most of the Arab states of the state of Israel, which I guess makes Israel and the Netanyahu administration sort of puff up and say, see what we've accomplished. And then the politics of the vaccine comes into play, which is the last point I just want to introduce, which of course Israel has been, along with England, at the forefront of vaccinating most people. In both cases, smallish countries, in both cases, good national health service. And the Israelis are also playing vaccine diplomacy, which others are also playing. So instead of giving vaccines to Gaza and the West Bank, although it does vaccinate the Arabs in the state of Israel itself, it has given vaccines to some of the neighboring Arab countries. Oh, Israel, now we're on good terms with you. We're going to give you some vaccines. And since countries are, interested in being in good relations when they've recognized countries, you can see that those countries will say, well, thank you, Israel, for giving us those vaccines. Now, of course, there are other players. There's Russia, there's China, and so forth, and everybody has vaccines nowadays that they are playing vaccine diplomacy with. But it's of some interest that Israeli policy continues to play ball with its former enemy Arab countries, even counter to the interest of the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. Let me stop and see where the questions are, because I've touched on lots of things without going into detail, because in a way I wanted to show you the shifting sands out there. One of the shifting sands being, as I said, the Arab-Israeli conflict has gone away. Another shifting sand is the diminishing in world opinion of Saudi Arabia, the diminishing of oil as being petroleum, as being the dominant leverage that countries have in that part of the world. And the other shift has been the shift in US politics towards that part of the world, which is, just at the beginning. And of course, the globalization of interests and policies of China, even in that part of the world, and the ongoing involvement of Russia, which especially, of course, in Syria, which is also continues to be a total mess. And, one can say based on history that the reasons, of course, the Russians got involved in Syria were a mistake in part by the US of not itself getting involved there. One can argue that it was smart of the Obama administration not to get too involved in Syria. But in any event, it gave an opening to the Russians. So you've got the Russians sitting in Syria, you've got the Chinese all over the place, you've got the Israelis now engaged with all of its Arab neighbors in one fashion or another, and you have the Iranians, which are estimable in terms of arms, terrorist capacity, and so on in that part of the world. And finally, I just want to say a cultural thing, and that is that from the perspective of the US, we just sort of look at these as sort of Middle East countries. But remember, the Middle East in various parts have been, really important historically in the development of Western civilization, whether it's all the religions, more or less, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, whether it's, forms of government, whether it's, art, pottery, whatever. So one of the bad things that has happened over the years in US policy is we're just mostly looking at the countries in the Middle East as sort of troublesome countries of one kind or another, or maybe they have resources we can use, which is very nice. But they themselves, whether it's Iran and the Persian, history, whether it's, Egypt, and by the way, Egypt, I don't seem to be rambling, Egypt has not been playing a big role in any of this because Egypt is in sufficient trouble domestically, economically. So Egypt, which normally plays a major role in the Middle East, hasn't been playing a role at all in all the discussion of all the different things that I've mentioned. And it's hard to underestimate how proud people are to be Iranians and the heirs of the Persian history, and ditto other parts of the Middle East. And we sometimes underappreciate it because we're a fairly new country and we don't have these kind of ancient roots, but they're important and people take a lot of pride in them. So let me open it to questions.
Okay, let me remind people they can submit questions through the Q&A feature of Zoom. For most computers, it's at the bottom of your screen. It says Q&A, click on it and you can type in a question. The first question that we have is, can you discuss the relationship of Iran and China? Are there common interests there, and is there potential for the two to leverage each other's power?
Yeah, well, China is trying to develop a common interest with everybody in terms of giving loans, in terms of, in this case, also get vaccines, in terms of investments, in terms of building infrastructure. On the other hand, you know, there have also been relations with Russia, and they've been there. So if you are Iran right now, and your economy is in the kind of free fall the Iranian economy is in, and you're dealing with such a young population, and you're trying to hold things together, the sort of religious part, and by the way, most Iranian young people are not necessarily super religious or anything. Many Iranians are quite secular, but the structure of the society is hinged on the importance of Shiite religion. Then you play ball with almost everybody. And it seems to me how important China is going to be in Iran in the future has a lot to do whether the nuclear treaty and all the participants, of which Russia is of course a participant, can reach some kind of agreement and accommodation with Iran. What happens after that is not clear, nor is it clear what would happen if the Iranians just dig in and say, you know, we are not going to discuss what we're doing and we're going to become nuclear. The problem, of course, with Iran becoming nuclear potentially is, and they're quite capable, they're scientists and so forth, is that that will generate a desire on the part of Saudi Arabia and others to also become nuclear. And that, of course, is very, very dangerous. So where China would fit in if Iran did not find an accommodation with the IAEA and the signatories to the treaty is hard to tell. But the Chinese at this point keep all options open. Theoretically, they're willing to be in almost every country.
That leads me to ask a question that occurred to me. One commentator I read recently was wondering whether or not the Secretary of State's emphasis on China as the major threat to the United States would prevent the Biden administration from focusing on other areas. And so, you know, it's kind of the can you talk and chew gum at the same time question.
Yeah. It is can you talk and chew gum kind of question, because everyone thinks that China will increasingly in this century be the dominant power in the world. And that's not about to stop. So then the question is, how does one relate if one is the declining power in the world to the rising power in the world? And I've talked about that before. The issue is whether or not the US will overstep itself on this particular issue of condemning China here, there, and yonder. And one of the issues, of course, has to do with cyber issues and cyber warfare and technology and so on. I think China is prepared, it's just a guess on my part, you know, to do two things simultaneously. They kind of understand that the US and other countries are nervous about it taking over in the world. At the same time, it's easier to become a dominant country in the world if you have reasonably good relations with the rest of the world. So I think unless the US really exaggerates its hostility and anger and sanctioning and whatnot with China, it will be able and should be able to cooperate with China on many things and at the same time differ in other areas. That would be the smart policy. It would be a policy that China would find acceptable based on how they have responded in the last 10 years or so.
Okay, I would remind the audience again to submit their questions through the Q&A function. Another question that I had was the whole MBS sanctions question, which you touched upon. But again, another commentator raised the point that isn't not sanctioning him encouraging other autocrats to do even worse in the future elsewhere?
Well, it would seem, I mean, superficially, you could sort of say, well, yes, of course. But on the other hand, if there are real disadvantages falling upon the country and the international perception of a head of state being weakened or their leverage being eroded, then others can say, well, okay, they didn't sanction MBS himself, but on the other hand, disadvantages to Saudi Arabia, which he obviously has an interest in governing, indicate that harmful things can happen to the country if the head of state behaves this way. But that leads one to jump very quickly to Putin and Russia, right? And Novotny. I mean, Putin essentially, sticks Novotny in jail and says, I don't care what the world thinks. I am a powerful leader and it really doesn't matter, right? But the only reason that he's able to do so in some ways, to say world opinion doesn't matter, is because the opinion of countries that count for him for economic purposes haven't come down on any kind of strong sanctioning of him. For example, the Europeans, for example, Germany, because of the pipeline that those countries enjoyed. Pipeline number one, pipeline number two is not that far from getting finished. So the criticism of Putin has been kind of muted on the part of some Western Europeans, right? And so then if you're Putin, you can say, well, you can get away with it. And it would give a model for others to get away with it. If on the other hand, you're Saudi Arabia and you're trying to diversify your economy and you really do need investments and so forth, and military, their entire military structure is linked to American arms and technology and so forth. You can't disaggregate that very quickly. But that gives the US leverage. And if things like that happen, others can say, well, that could happen to us and that's not so good. So I'm not giving a very satisfactory answer because the test, the test really is in a very gray area. And yes, it could be possible that others saying, if we capture some journalist somewhere and chop them up, this is what's going to happen to us. But on the other hand, much of the linkage and much of the relationships are in a fairly gray area, right? And after all, journalists got killed in Iraq and in Syria and so forth. We haven't, the sanctions always sound so great, right? All you have to do is announce sanctions, but the nature of the sanctions and how important what you're sanctioning is to the future functioning of the country is an open question that is specific to the country and specific to the circumstance. And sometimes, you read the US newspaper and saying so-and-so, they've been sanctions or whatever, but they've just been sanctioned, let's say, from importing wine from California or something like that, right? So the nature of the sanctions have to be looked at and whether they will bite. And in terms of Saudi Arabia, that's an open question. Are the sanctions against Saudi Arabia based on this without sanctioning and doing anything about MBS himself, are they sufficient to let other people see, well, this was not such a good idea?
Another question from a participant. What is the status of Jared Kushner's touted negotiations in the Middle East besides excluding Palestine from discussion?
Well, actually, you know, when Kushner in liaison with Israel can be credited in part to the recognition of Israel by all of these different states, because Kushner under the Trump administration pushed both Israel and the United States to make it pay worthwhile for those countries to recognize Israel. So even though, you know, Kushner is in bad repute and Trump, amongst, I suppose, most people who are tuning into this, is in bad repute, one could arguably say, and may say historically, that a combination of Trump and Kushner and Netanyahu managed to get recognition for Israel by giving all of these countries impetus to say, okay, you know, Israel, we can recognize Israel. It doesn't take much effort, but we get all these goodies and all these benefits as a consequence. So I think history will record that the Trump administration, right-wing, whatever, crazy administration, in conjunction with Netanyahu, very right-wing administration, also corrupt, by the way, has managed to pull this off. And they might get some historical credit for it.
Well, I was going to leave this to the end, but since you mentioned Netanyahu, I'm wondering if your crystal ball is at all clear on the Israeli election.
No, almost every party that will be in alliance with Netanyahu will be some right-wing party. All right, the Labour Party has a new leader, a woman, as a matter of fact, and there is no anticipation that Labour will win the election. So it will be some combination of right-wing political parties. And, you know, if you're talking about Israel is always like touching the third rail, because as soon as one says derogatory things about Israeli politics, American in particular, American Jews in particular, will say, well, that's anti-Semitic. No, 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 that's common. You don't have to, it has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. If you lived in Israel and you were a liberal or progressive, you would hate that administration as much as outsiders who wish Israel would have a different government, right? So we're talking about two entirely separate things. Many, many Israelis are very, very unhappy with the Netanyahu administration and very unhappy that the prospect of the next administration, Netanyahu may be in or he may be out, but the winning combination, chances are a combination of right-wing parties with maybe some centrists, but the right-wing parties can, you know, carry some leverage, because if they don't go along in the Knesset, then the government falls apart and you have these endless elections, the outcomes of which are not very different from one from the other. So in some senses, Israeli politics are stuck between a rock and a hard place, I would say right now.
Going back to a question from a participant on a slightly different topic, do you see skepticism on the part of European allies as well as others of US reliability and honesty after the Trump administration?
Yes, is the short answer. The long answer is they are very favorably inclined with the Biden administration, and they're not skeptical on the whole so far about the Biden administration trying to rectify some of the messes of the Trump administration in international affairs. They may not agree with everything, but you know, it now looks like grown-ups and professionals are in charge again, and it looks like, you know, reasonably policy will be pursued and alliances will be honored and all the rest of it. But as I talked about it in some past talks, the world has shifted, right? And one of the things that has shifted is there is considerable insecurity, especially in Europe, as to what will happen 4 years from now. Will the Republicans come back? And will the folks that met with Trump in Florida and continue to say he wasn't, he's still the president, Biden wasn't really elected? Will those people come into power again? So they're relieved that Biden administration is in power, or at least that's what their leaders in the press indicate. And they're very concerned about the long term. So they're being very cautious in approaching the future of the US and their alliances with the US.
Another question, you said there is not much heard from Egypt, but is the water issue and dams built on the Nile potentially a major issue affecting many countries?
Yes, that's an interesting question. I'm glad somebody raised that. So they're building a dam and of the Nile, right? So the countries that will be affected are Ethiopia, the Sudan, and Egypt. And Egypt, it looks at the moment still that Egypt will lose some of its water. And we're talking about desertification, climate change, and water will be, a dominant commodity and a basis of conflict. Those negotiations are still going on, and it depends on which week you're talking about, whether they look like, reasonable accommodations can be made between the countries so everybody feels that they get a fair or at least adequate share. I would not be too optimistic about this. And if these negotiations fall apart, you could have serious water wars in that part of the world, I would guess.
As we get ready to close, people have said to you and others that sometimes we come away from your talks with not much hope. Do you see anything in the region at all that is reason for hope and optimism, or is it all pessimistic?
Yes, I mean, I think that the fact that the oil is no longer the only vehicle for future well-being in that part of the world, and the countries are having to diversify, is a good thing. That's the first thing. The second thing is that much of the sort of like Arab Emirates and those countries are heavily dependent on outside workers. And as almost the entire workforce in some of those countries, it comes from the Philippines and Bangladesh and places like that. I mean, that's been halted to some extent during the virus, but in any event, that'll come back. And that means that they are in some senses at the forefront of showing that people can move around and find work elsewhere in some reasonable fashion. The other thing that is not hopeful, that's not what the question was, is the fact that the population in that part of the world, indigenous part of the population, is so incredibly young. That in most of the countries, close to 40% of the population is under the age of 20. And that is a huge future economic problem. And I'm, sort of, I don't want to sound too romantic about this, but unemployment or change of employment, people moving out of rural areas and blue collar jobs, is a worldwide problem as technology changes. And we're going to have to talk about technology and its impact on world affairs, maybe next time. As those things change, models have to be developed in the more industrial world as to what you do with your labor force when in fact you don't have, endless factory jobs and all the rest of it. And it's hopeful that because it has to be figured out in Europe and the United States and other countries, even China down the road, it's helpful for countries in North Africa and the Middle East to maybe see other people figuring out a way what to do with the younger population and how to employ them and so forth. So that's in some senses a long-term, later in the century, hopeful kind of sign. The other thing is that if the US and China and Russia could stop selling the incredible amount of arms to everybody in that part of the world, that would be obviously helpful. And there are some sort of embryonic discussions about arms treaties and controls and so forth. But that too is in the distant future. I do think that some accommodation could be reached with Iran, and that would be very helpful. If, for example, Iran would get the bank loans that it wants and would stop being, considered a pariah state, a bargain might be for it to stop interfering in the affairs of Lebanon and allow that small country, which is a nightmare right now in terms of its economics and politics, and that Hezbollah would not be, trying to destroy that part of the world. Make trouble, because even maybe Iran could reach some accommodations with Israel down the road. I mean, I'm just spinning sort of fantasy here, but you could sit over, I don't know, a bourbon or a glass of wine and map how in 25 or 30 years, that part of the world, in the Middle East at least, North Africa, the Middle East, could stabilize and would not be necessarily run by horrendously awful dictators. Bear in mind that almost all those countries, the Arab Spring did not take root. So all of those countries have dictators. The one country that's often mentioned as having benefited from the Arab Spring is Tunisia, which sort of has a democratic system, but they're struggling with it. And they're also struggling with unemployment and so forth. So I tend to be, I guess it's the nature of my business, tend to be optimistic. Things can be done, things can be changed. Everything is not negative, but you have to take advantage of opportunities. And it does not help, even in the context of a US decline in world affairs, for the US to play a negative role rather than a positive role. And let me end here with a hobby horse comment on my part, and which is that one of the fundamental economic leverages that the United States has on all of these countries and many countries in the world is military. The largest chunk of US foreign aid is not, in fact, humanitarian aid, but military aid. And the big corporations that produce military, whether it's, small arms, whether it's rockets, whether it's, whatever, drones, whatever the new technology is, the companies that produce that for the US Defense Department are very dependent on sales around the rest of the world, right? And unless that is slowed down and stepped aside, all we're doing is being enablers for future conflict and violence everywhere. And that's something I think as Americans we have to own, is that it's not just China or Russia or whatever. It is the United States that has been one of the biggest arms merchants in the world. By the way, it's also France, to take another Western country. And unless, somebody makes inroads and all of that, even in the United States, for heaven's sake, we are paying companies huge amounts of money for military hardware that is obsolete, that is in fact not being used anymore, or would not be the use of choice if there was a conflict, because that's what they do and that's what they get paid for. So I think if one is interested in making possible political conflict in some of these countries less warlike, less harmful, moving it from military and terrorism and guerrilla conflict to political conflicts and economic conflicts, the US has much to contribute as a role model. And up until this point, the US has been guilty of perpetuating the system. And we need to own up to it and come to some examination of why we're doing this. Can we do something else? Should we be doing something else?
Okay, thanks, Ronnie. And I hope everybody enjoyed today's webinar with Ronnie. Join us again 2 weeks on Monday, March 22nd at 11 a.m. for another in the webinar series of commentaries on international affairs with Ronnie Gruhn. Thank you.
Thanks. Be well, everybody.